Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Libya's first election of the post-Gaddafi era, and it's a huge test for the post-Gaddafi media. A Syrian defector flees to Turkey. He's not a soldier, he's a journalist. The story of the showdown in Kashmir, getting out through some alternative online voices. And if the internet can make a star of your keyboard's lowly hash key, then there's hope for all of us.
Move your body with the hashtag.
That's in our web video of the week. Here's the challenge facing the Libyan media. Roughly 8 months after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, they have an election to cover. There are 142 registered political parties, more than 3,000 candidates on the ballot, more than 100 media outlets that did not exist under Gaddafi, doing the reporting in a country with no modern tradition of critical journalism, to an electorate that has not cast a vote in a meaningful election in generations. So what could possibly go wrong? We've already watched the complicated transition to democracy in Tunisia and Egypt through their elections. What sets Libya apart, however, is that the revolution there swept away not just the regime, it also took down the state media machine to an extent not seen elsewhere in the Arab Spring, creating a vacuum that has drawn scores of Libyans into the field of journalism. Our starting point this week is Tripoli, where a revolution that got its start on February 15th, 2011, culminates July 7th, 2012, on Election Day.
The problem with covering elections, you need professional cadre of journalists who understand how to cover elections, multi-party elections.
There's also the issue of the amount of time that the media has had to prepare for this kind of election, the sheer number of candidates.
2,500 candidates for the independent seats and another 1,200 for the party seats. And they have 100 political parties. So just try and wrap your head around that.
It's going to be a breakthrough election. It's going to be a learning curve for candidates, for parties, for the media.
It has been just 9 months since the final gruesome chapter of the Gaddafi story was captured on a mobile phone, uploaded into cyberspace, then beamed around the world. Post-revolutionary Libya is a country in a hurry, and no one, not the media, nor the interim government, nor the candidates who want to be in government, is as prepared as they would like to be for this election.
So there's been, I'd say, quite a few challenges that this election story has posed to Libyan media. This is the first time that this kind of election has been covered, and of course there's the lack of experience or expertise technically and professionally within the media environment itself.
I mean, in the US elections, we really have, what, 2 parties to vet, and even the coverage of those elections can be so highly flawed. Now put yourself in the position of an editor at a Libyan newspaper or website. How can you possibly go through all these mostly unknown political parties, unproven because they just started up?
My media outlet, the Libya Herald, we have been trying to give wide coverage, but you can't give coverage to 100 parties. Those who have stepped up and gave us information and supplied photographs and given interviews, we have covered, and those who are still struggling with their own campaign have obviously not had any coverage. It is, I'm afraid, going to be survival of the fittest and the strongest.
Or the wealthiest. And those same Darwinian principles apply to the media outlets themselves. The rush to fill the informational vacuum has produced hundreds of new channels, titles, and websites, a fraction of which will survive. There have already been casualties.
There was a huge surge in the beginning during the revolution and post-revolution in terms of the number of media outlets that were available. And this has indeed shrunk over time because of, well, first of all, many of the volunteers went to their workplace, and many outlets were not able to sustain themselves financially.
The ones who managed to survive were the ones who were able to connect with the people and attract an audience. I can name like Al-Asama TV or Capital TV as an example where they've had recently trained reporters who were able to do a little bit of investigative journalism for publications like the Libyan magazine that has been tracking issues around minorities, women, and youth in particular, and that's why it was able to establish a following.
For much of the civil war, large parts of Libya were lawless. and the media still work in an environment with almost no rules. The country's new constitution has yet to be written. Therefore, journalists have no constitutional protections guaranteeing freedom of the press. The one media law that has been passed by the NTC, the National Transitional Council, is known as Article 37, and journalists don't like it.
It's aimed at speech that glorifies Gaddafi, insults Islam, insults the revolution, and more vaguely lowers the morale of Libyan citizens. And these are punishable by prison sentences. And on the other hand, what's interesting to watch is the response to it, which is that reporters there, and they're challenging the NTC. And although the NTC has been slow to repeal the law or to change it, what it is doing is it's meeting with the media and is addressing these concerns, at least, in terms of hearing them out.
The NTC has been sending mixed messages to the media because when they came into power, they automatically said, these are the standards for the revolution. We're going to have a free and independent media. Nevertheless, there are certain red lines that the NTC maintains and imposes on reporters, and I think they're tightening their grip and they're reneging on some of the promises they've made early on.
One of the most disturbing stories during the revolution was Iman al-Obeidi's. She was the woman who told foreign journalists she had been gang raped by forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi. After being taken away, she was maligned on a state-run TV channel where a newsreader, a woman, called al-Obeidi a prostitute.
حتى العاهرة أحيانا قد تكون عندها وطنية تجاه الوطن عندما تعرف أن وطنها في خطر حتى العاهرة.
That channel was Al Jamahiriya, a version of which remains on the air, but its loyalties have shifted.
I mean, this is where we really start to differentiate between the Libyan and the Egyptian revolution. The Libyan revolution was really whole scale. If I can use the parable of the tree was pulled out from its roots, whereas I could say in Egypt, the top of the tree was cut off, and the supreme command of the army are still there. In Libya, everything was taken over by the people in Libya, and the revolution took over all the television stations.
But it wasn't the same as Egypt, where overnight stations and networks change alliances. In Libya, news anchors, producers just stopped showing up to work, and sometimes they were tracked down and threatened at gunpoint to return to work. And even now, there are people who haven't returned to work yet, and these are the people who are still pro-Gaddafi. They just simply will not return to work for the media because they know that they'll have to report news that won't glorify Gaddafi, and they're not willing to do it.
In Libya, some old habits die hard, and fallen leaders die harder. For 4 decades, the media here served Muammar Gaddafi. In the 9 months since his death, Libyans have experienced growing pains and lessons learned. They've read in their new papers and watched on their new channels accounts of the first steps towards a new democracy in a country where journalism, warts and all, has been reborn. Our Global Village Voices now on the revolution in the Libyan media space.
At first we had media with no opinion, and now slowly that media has started to develop opinion, and at first it had a negative impact, but as soon as elections came up, everybody wanted it to be for the good of the country. The campaign has involved the media in a faster way and has acted as a catalyst to get people to actually go out there and ask questions and get answers from the people that will be decision makers in the country.
The issues that new journalists face is that there has been no formal training. There has been no infrastructure of civil society with which to fall back on. So there's no concept of ethics, of investigative journalism, of protection of sources, etc. You also need to be wary of how you define journalism, of how information is viewed and synthesized, and how its role in the new government, and have an awareness of the need of grassroots training and a precaution against incoming external influences who may want to mold the shape of Libyan journalism to come.
We're always looking for new faces for the program. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the news media as one of our Global Village Voices, you can connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, where we will let you know what stories we're working on. Or you can get in touch with us via email at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. And don't forget our free video podcast on iTunes. Just go looking for the Listening Post, Al Jazeera English, and you'll find us there. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The media war over Syria has seen its first high-profile defector. According to the Guardian newspaper, Kahtan Slibi, a TV presenter, has abandoned his post on pro-regime television and fled the country. Slibi reportedly showed up in Turkey on June 27th, having traveled overland from eastern Syria where he was based. The 33-year-old reporter worked for the state-owned Al Akbariya network and for Al Dunya, a private television channel run by President Assad's cousin. From Turkey, he posted this message about one of his former employers.
أعلن انشقاقي عن الإعلام السوري والسبب من ذلك أن قناة الأخبارية لا تملك أي مقومات حقيقية من الإعلام الصادق وعدم احترامها لمراسليها بإرسالهم الأخبار الحقيقية التي تحدث في الشارع السوري.
Slibi told The Guardian that he first made contact with the Free Syrian Army last November, but the FSA encouraged him to stay in his job so that he could supply rebel forces with intelligence, which Slibi says he has been doing over Skype. Police in Sri Lanka have raided the offices of two major opposition news websites and arrested 9 of their employees. On June 29th, officers from Sri Lanka's Criminal Investigation Department turned up at premises shared by Lanka Mirror and Lanka X News. Acting on a court order, the police seized equipment and detained several journalists for one night before releasing them on bail. Both websites are connected to Sri Lanka's opposition party, the UNP, and have been highly critical of the government. The sites have been accused of defaming President Rajapaksa and reporting stories in, quote, an incorrect and vulgar manner, unquote. Critics say that this is another blow to press freedom in a country which has seen a string of attacks against independent news media. In a statement, Bob Dietz from the Committee to Protect Journalists said Friday's raid shows that President Mahinda Rajapaksa's government remains determined to silence opposition voices. Authorities should heed the many public appeals urging them to reverse this years-long policy of quashing media criticism of the government and military. In Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez is still at loggerheads with television channels owned by his right-wing opponents, and with an election coming up in October, you can expect things to remain that way. Global Vision TV says it will pay a $2.1 million fine after the government took it to court over coverage of prison riots in Venezuela last year. Global Vision first tried to fight the fine, but it relented last week after the Supreme Court upheld the judgment and threatened to take the channel off the air. The channel's vice president, Guillermo Zuloaga, said from Miami, where he's in exile, that paying the fine was the only way to keep Global Vision in business, and that the government is trying to intimidate the news media ahead of presidential elections in which Chavez will seek a third term. The Chavez government, through its regulator, has already taken one television channel, RCTV, off the air for supporting a coup attempt against Chavez back in 2002. And the president has accused Global Vision of backing that same coup and of plotting to assassinate him. Here's some free legal advice for Americans who use Twitter. What you say on that site is considered by the courts to be public property. The microblogging website has just lost a case in a New York court to prosecutors who want Twitter to hand over 3 months' worth of tweets from a protester who was involved with the Occupy movement. The tweeter, Malcolm Harris, was among 700 protesters arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge last year. He was charged with disorderly conduct. Prosecutors say that his tweets will provide critical evidence in the case. The judge agreed, and lawyers for the defense say they are considering an appeal. Twitter says that this ruling is disappointing and says that complying with the request would violate American privacy laws. The legal case involves a relatively minor criminal charge. However, the decision could have wider implications for civil liberties in the evolving social media age. The dispute between India and Pakistan over Kashmir has been a flashpoint on the subcontinent ever since 1947. There are more than 500,000 troops positioned on the Indian side alone, but you don't hear much about it, and that's how the Indian authorities like it. Local reporters work under a strict curfew in Kashmir. Internet access is sporadic. Even text messaging services in the valley are frequently cut off by the powers that be. What has resulted journalistically is a government-led narrative rarely contested in mainstream media outlets. That started to change in 2010 when thousands of Kashmiris took to the streets and new online voices were heard for the first time. In the 2 years since, Kashmiri bloggers, filmmakers, and authors have all taken their stories to web audiences in India, Pakistan, and the world. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the rise of the Kashmiri alternative media collective.
It was called the Kashmiri Intifada. Thousands of protesters faced off against Indian troops and demanded an end to what they call the military occupation of Kashmir.
There certainly is a curfew in place, only police vehicles, ambulances in sight.
Journalists and camera teams have been intimidated and told to stay home.
There is this massive uprising against Indian rule in Kashmir, and lots of people, mostly young people, are killed on the streets of Kashmir. And at the same time, there are huge curbs on media in Kashmir. Newspapers don't go to press, local TV channels are taken off, there's a ban on text messaging. Even journalists who go to report are beaten up on the streets. So in that environment, a fascinating thing happens. All these young people, without a formal structure, converge, and there's this almost near explosion of new media activity in 2010.
Go to thekashmirwala.com today. The website is an insider's storybook of life in Kashmir. On one of its pages is a daily tracker of the text messaging ban that Indian authorities switch on and off in the valley. The site is run by Fahad Shah, who began the Kashmirwala as a blog and battled patchy internet connections and official clampdowns on reporting to photograph, write and publish all through the demonstrations of 2010.
In 2010, when protests started, I was working with a local newspaper. I was running this blog also. I was just writing the stories which erupted during protests. I was writing some stories on the profile of a person who died, who passed away, who was killed or something. There was a boy in our neighborhood. His name was Umar Koyum Bhatt. He was arrested on Friday afternoon, then taken to a police station. Then he was beaten up. He died. I went to his home and I talked to his family. I talked to the medical officials. I talked to the persons, administration persons, and then I wrote a full story on him.
Fahad Shah and many others like him didn't feel that there was enough coverage of what was happening on the ground.
There are shoot-at-sight orders, remember, in Kashmir for anyone disrupting the peace.
And if there was coverage, it wasn't the kind of coverage they wished to see. So that must have driven somebody like Fahad Shah, because there's suddenly this space for narrativization of what was happening. It becomes very popular because there is a need, there is a hunger from so-called alternate voices from Kashmir.
And the alternative voices are making themselves heard online. Roshan Elahi, who calls himself MC Cash, is a rapper from Kashmir's capital city, Srinagar. He released his first song, I Protest, on YouTube at the height of the 2010 demonstrations.
Sponsored media who hide this homicide.
Elahi's song went viral and became the anthem for many young Kashmiris facing off against Indian troops. Kashmiri news media is moving online as well. The Kashmir Reader, Kashmir Dispatch and the Vox Kashmir reflect a view from the ground that you won't get from mainstream news correspondents reporting from the press enclave in Srinagar. The people clicking onto these sites are from all over the world, but their most significant readerships are to be found in India and Pakistan. The two countries have fought 3 wars over Kashmir, and the mainstream media narratives in both countries have become deeply politicized.
Does going back to pre-1953 for Jammu and Kashmir really emerge as a solution?
On the Indian side, there's a fairly orthodox position on Kashmir, which sees it as an internal matter of India, and Pakistan as the interloper. And of course, this is mirrored in Pakistan, where they believe that this is the unfinished agenda of Pakistan. Historically, that's how Kashmir has been constructed. As a dispute between India and Pakistan, and the mainstream media on both sides has consistently, that's the way it has chosen to represent it.
The mainstream media reports to some certain level, after which they don't move. They just maintain a balance, maybe to maintain peace, but people don't find it good. People find it biased.
This generation of Kashmiris, many of them are fed up with this mediation by Indian and Pakistani media. So somewhere down the line, what happens is, as this generation grows up, they think that we can do this. You know, if somebody can come from Delhi or Bombay and do a cover story on Kashmir, and at some point these people must have thought, we live here and we can write and we can do this. It's also a political statement that we do not accept your version of events here.
They do not accept it, and they are beginning to change it. Kashmir's journalists and writers are not just growing louder and bolder. They've begun to have an impact on how the mainstream media report the Kashmir story.
It's not so much what the news media is carrying, but what it pushes the mainstream media into doing, which has become significant.
Kashmir's generation next has taken to the internet.
Those alternative voices are beginning to color the mainstream discourse. I'm not saying that it has been able to dislodge it, but people are beginning to, for the first time, both in India and Pakistan, concede that there is a third element in this conversation, which is the voice of the Kashmiri people.
These websites and these blogs, they put daily pressure on newspapers because they will publish something on the front page or the inside pages, and then they see the same story covered in these websites in different ways, or with a different perspective, or even a different side to the story. So which means those editors and those journalists are constantly reading these things, and sometimes they have no option but to incorporate what's appearing in alternate media into their journalism and reportage and coverage, which I think is a brilliant thing.
Because it signals that the Kashmiri voice is moving from graffiti on the streets to websites on the internet, from the fringes of the debate to the center of the discussion, from what they call alternative spaces onto the front pages in the mainstream media.
More Global Village voices now on the various kinds of news coverage coming out of Kashmir.
Journalists in Kashmir have been working through very difficult times. They have come under pressure from different sources. Sometimes a story which doesn't suit the security forces has produced an adverse reaction from them. And sometimes if the story is not in the favor of the separatist fighters, they definitely have come and intimidated the journalists. And yet I may tell you that the journalists in Kashmir, by far and large, have withstood these pressures. As a journalist sees, he writes his copy as he sees it, not as somebody would like him to write his copy or do his report.
In Indian media, they never show the clear picture of the happenings in Kashmir. Let me give you an example. A few years back, when the people of Kashmir were protesting against India, the Indian media portrayed as if all the protesting people were paid mob, which is absolutely untrue.
Finally, the hashtag. A few years ago, that hash symbol on your computer keyboard was one of those keys that did not get a lot of use. It was a waste of space. Seldom in the history of typography has a key enjoyed this kind of late-in-life renaissance. From the Green Movement in Iran to the Arab Spring to the Occupy movement, the Twitterati have used the hashtag to link people together in common causes. How did adding a simple hash to the beginning of a word or a phrase become second nature to social media users? Producer-songwriter Paul Noel has come up with his own musical history of the once humble hashtag's rise to global prominence. It's our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Banana? What's the deal with these little number sign hashtag things? I mean, they're cool and all, but there's no space in between the words. And one more thing. Where did they come from and how did they start? I decided to get to the bottom of this, and this is what I found out. A guy by the name of Chris Mincina, computer programmer, blogger, real winner, is credited to introducing hashtags to Twitter. Move your body with the hashtag. A tweet from August 23, 2007 helped start this hashtag revolution. I dug up the tweet, and this is what it says. You can read it to yourself while I play the trombone. A couple months later, in the fall, the San Diego wildfires were growing tall. Resident writer and a one named Nat Ritter started the first major hash on Twitter. In order to spread the word of needed help, hashtag craze was really felt. In a not too long, the pound sign changed life forever. Then 2009, it was a turbulent time. The Iranian election, when it unwind, the hashtag fad moved international, even working its way to the capital. Okay, then what happened was Twitter started trending topics in 2010. And they started linking all the hashtags into groups. And now you see hashtags everywhere, not even on Twitter. Oh, those hashtags.